What if I told you that the crack epidemic, the scourge that devastated black communities across America in the 1980s, wasn't just a tragic accident of history? What if I told you that a drug pipeline, stretching from the jungles of Colombia to the streets of Los Angeles, had ties to the very organization sworn to protect the United States, the Central Intelligence Agency? This is the story of how war, drugs, and politics collided in the most explosive scandal of the 20th century. A scandal that would destroy lives, shatter communities, and expose the dark underbelly of U.S. foreign policy. The story begins in the 1980s, during one of the tensest periods of the Cold War. The United States was locked in a global battle with the Soviet Union, not just with weapons, but with ideology. In Nicaragua, a small Central American nation, the revolutionary Sandinista government had taken power, overthrowing the brutal US-backed dictator Anastasio Somoza. The Sandinistas promised equality, land reform, and a better future for Nicaragua's poor. But to the Reagan administration, they weren't reformers, they were communists. And in Reagan's eyes, communism was a cancer, spreading dangerously close to America's borders. To counter the Sandinistas, Reagan's administration began supporting the Contras, a group of anti-communist rebels based in the mountains and jungles of Nicaragua. The Contras weren't freedom fighters, as Reagan often called them. They were mercenaries and guerrillas, infamous for their brutality. Their tactics included assassinations, torture, and attacks on civilian villages. The Contras' campaign of terror left thousands of civilians dead and displaced. But none of that mattered to Reagan. What mattered was that the Contras were willing to fight communism. There was just one problem: Congress. In 1982, lawmakers passed the Boland Amendment, cutting off direct U.S. funding to the Contras. The amendment was a response to mounting evidence of Contra atrocities, as well as public opposition to another Vietnam-like proxy war. Officially, America's hands were tied, but unofficially, the Reagan administration had no intention of letting the Contras fail. The solution? A covert war, funded through back channels, hidden from the American public. The CIA became the key player, tasked with keeping the Contras armed, supplied, and in the fight. To bypass Congress, the Reagan administration turned to unconventional and illegal means of funding the Contras. These efforts included weapons sales to Iran, secret arms shipments, and deals brokered by shadowy figures in Central America. But there was another pipeline that would prove far more destructive: drugs. By the early 1980s, Colombia's cocaine cartels were booming. The CIA saw an opportunity. Contra factions in Nicaragua began working with Colombian cartels to smuggle cocaine into the United States. The profits from these deals funneled back into the war effort. This wasn't just a war in the jungles of Nicaragua. It was a war with ripple effects. A war whose cost would be paid not in the mountains of Central America, but in the streets of American cities. The US government's covert war in Nicaragua was supposed to stop communism. Instead, it unleashed a chain reaction, a pipeline of drugs, violence, and devastation that would forever change America. But the real impact was still to come. To fund their war against the Sandinistas, the Contras turned to an unlikely ally: cocaine. Colombia's cartels, flush with cash and eager to expand their reach, supplied the Contras with cocaine, which was smuggled into the United States. The profits funneled back to Nicaragua to buy weapons, ammunition, and supplies for their brutal war. But the Contras weren't working alone. Allegations would later emerge that the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, desperate to keep the Contras afloat, turned a blind eye to the drug trafficking. Some even claim the CIA actively facilitated it. While the extent of the CIA's involvement remains debated, one thing is clear: drugs from Central America were flooding American streets, and the profits were financing a covert war. This is where the story gets even darker. The cocaine flowing out of Central America didn't just land anywhere. It landed here, in Los Angeles. And it didn't stay as powder. It was cooked into something stronger, cheaper, and deadlier: crack cocaine. Crack cocaine swept through black neighborhoods like wildfire. It was cheap, accessible, and instantly addictive. Families were torn apart. Crime rates soared. Entire communities were hollowed out, replaced by fear, violence, and despair. But this wasn't just a drug problem. It was an economic and social catastrophe, one that disproportionately targeted African American communities. Gangs like the Bloods and Crips became central players in the crack trade, escalating violence as they fought for control of the lucrative market. But the empire behind this deadly epidemic had its roots in Central America, and one man in Los Angeles would become its linchpin. Meet Freeway Rick Ross. In the 1980s, Ross built a crack cocaine empire in Los Angeles, supplying drugs to street gangs across the city. At his peak, Ross was moving millions of dollars worth of cocaine each day, fueling the explosion of crack in urban America. But Ross wasn't just any dealer. His supplier was a man named Danilo Blandon, a Nicaraguan exile with ties to the Contras. And here's where things get even more unsettling. Blandon's cocaine pipeline allegedly had ties to the CIA. Journalist Gary Webb's explosive investigation would later reveal the full extent of this connection. Webb uncovered evidence that Blandon and other Nicaraguan traffickers were using their drug profits to support the Contra war effort. The crack epidemic wasn't just a crisis. It was collateral damage in a secret war thousands of miles away. For Black Americans living in neighborhoods devastated by crack, Webb's revelations weren't just shocking. They were infuriating. The idea that their suffering had been enabled or ignored by their own government was a betrayal that would shake the nation to its core. Danilo Blandon himself would later testify that he had trafficked cocaine to support the Contras, raising serious questions about what the CIA knew and when they knew it. While the CIA has consistently denied direct involvement, its failure to intervene or even investigate speaks volumes. The cocaine pipeline wasn't just a means of funding a covert war. It was a weapon, one that destroyed lives, shattered families, and left entire communities in ruins. But what happened next would expose the full cost of this dirty war and force America to confront a truth it had long tried to ignore. In August 1996, journalist Gary Webb published a 3-part investigative series in the San Jose Mercury News that would change the way America saw the crack epidemic. The series, titled Dark Alliance, laid out a stunning and deeply controversial claim that the crack cocaine trade devastating Black communities in Los Angeles was directly tied to a U.S. government-backed war in Central America. Webb's investigation focused on a Nicaraguan drug network operating in California. He alleged that this network had funneled millions of dollars in cocaine profits to the Contras, with the knowledge and possible complicity of the CIA. The CIA's involvement with the Contras wasn't new. During the Iran-Contra scandal, it was revealed that senior officials in the Reagan administration had secretly sold weapons to Iran and funneled the proceeds to the Contras, bypassing Congress. But Webb's reporting suggested something far darker, that the CIA had allowed cocaine trafficking to flourish, knowing the profits were being used to fund the war. Webb's story centered on the relationship between Danilo Blandon, a Nicaraguan exile and major cocaine supplier, and Freeway Rick Ross, the Los Angeles drug kingpin who built a crack empire in the 1980s. Blandon admitted in court that he had trafficked cocaine to support the Contras. He even claimed that his drug sales were sanctioned by powerful figures in the Contra leadership. Webb's reporting linked Blandon to Contra leaders and accused the CIA of turning a blind eye, or worse, to the drug trade. But that wasn't all. Webb argued that the cocaine smuggled by Blandon's network had sparked the crack epidemic in urban America, creating a direct line from the jungles of Nicaragua to the streets of south-central Los Angeles. The Dark Alliance series sent shockwaves across the country, particularly in Black communities, which had borne the brunt of the crack epidemic. For many, Webb's reporting confirmed long-held suspicions that the U.S. government had allowed drugs to destroy their neighborhoods while pursuing its own political agenda abroad. The anger was palpable. People demanded accountability, not just from the CIA, but from the entire U.S. government. In November 1996, CIA Director John Deutsch traveled to Los Angeles to address the community's concerns. It was a rare public appearance for the agency, and it didn't go well. Deutsch's denials did little to calm the outrage. For many, the damage had already been done. But Webb wasn't just fighting the government, he was fighting the media. Major newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times launched blistering critiques of Webb's series, accusing him of oversimplifying the evidence and sensationalizing the story. Webb's reputation took a hit. Under pressure, the San Jose Mercury News distanced itself from his reporting. Webb was eventually reassigned, and he resigned in 1997. But Webb wasn't entirely wrong. In the years that followed, declassified documents revealed that the CIA had, at the very least, turned a blind eye to Contra drug trafficking. Internal investigations admitted that the agency had ignored evidence of drug smuggling to protect its covert operations. While the CIA has always denied direct involvement, its negligence and its prioritization of Cold War objectives over the lives of its own citizens cannot be denied. The fallout from the Dark Alliance wasn't just about journalism. It was about the devastating cost of America's foreign policy decisions, paid in the lives of its most vulnerable citizens. Gary Webb's career never recovered from the backlash. In 2004, he died by allegedly unaliving himself, leaving behind a legacy of fearless reporting and a story that continues to haunt the nation. But Webb's work uncovered something undeniable, that the crack epidemic wasn't just a tragedy. It was a scandal fueled by greed, politics, and the cold calculations of a covert war. The question now is, what happens when the truth finally comes to light? The crack epidemic didn't just devastate Black America, it redefined it. Entire neighborhoods, once thriving and filled with life, became epicenters of addiction and violence. It wasn't just the drugs. Crack cocaine unleashed a chain reaction of destruction. It hollowed out communities from the inside, dismantling the social fabric that held families together. Addiction spread like wildfire, leaving mothers to mourn, fathers to disappear, and children to fend for themselves. Then came the laws. In 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, ushering in mandatory minimum sentences that disproportionately targeted crack cocaine, penalties 100 times harsher than those for powder cocaine. The disparity wasn't just about the drugs, it was about race. Crack was seen as a black drug, while powder cocaine was associated with wealthier white users. The result? An explosion of mass incarceration that disproportionately swept up young Black men. By the 1990s, the United States had become the world's largest jailer. The so-called war on drugs was no war at all. It was a policy of containment, waged on America's poorest communities. The toll wasn't just measured in arrests, it was measured in lives lost. Overdoses skyrocketed. Violence erupted as gangs fought for control of the lucrative drug trade. And the stigma of crack addiction left entire families ostracized, struggling to survive in a society that saw them as criminals rather than victims. For many, the revelations about CIA negligence weren't just shocking, they were enraging. They confirmed what these communities had long suspected, that their lives had been sacrificed for a political agenda thousands of miles away. For children growing up in these neighborhoods, the crack epidemic wasn't just a tragedy, it was their reality. Schools closed, opportunities vanished, dreams were replaced by survival. Entire generations were lost to the cycle of addiction, incarceration, and poverty. For decades, the government's response to the crack epidemic focused on punishment, not prevention. Billions were spent on policing and prisons, while funding for addiction treatment and community support lagged far behind. But the question lingered: how did it come to this? The answer, in part, lies in decisions made far from the streets of South Central Los Angeles, decisions made in Washington, D.C., and the jungles of Central America. When Gary Webb's Dark Alliance series exposed the CIA's negligence, it wasn't just a journalistic revelation. It was a moral indictment. The devastation of the crack epidemic wasn't just about drugs. It was about policy, about neglect, and about a system that allowed entire communities to fall through the cracks. The story of the CIA and Contra cocaine trafficking isn't just about drugs. It's about choices. Choices made in secret meeting rooms and covert operations that sacrificed entire communities in the name of geopolitics. It's about how the ripple effects of one decision, one covert war, can devastate lives half a world away. For decades, the truth was buried, hidden beneath layers of secrecy, denial, and disinformation. But here's the thing about the truth. No matter how deeply it's buried, it has a way of surfacing. Gary Webb's investigation may have cost him his career, and eventually his life. But his work sparked a reckoning. It forced America to confront a painful reality: that the cost of Cold War geopolitics wasn't just paid in the jungles of Nicaragua, it was paid in the streets of Los Angeles. The crack epidemic wasn't an accident, it was a consequence of war, of politics, of a system that placed power above people. But here's the lesson: while the past cannot be undone, it can be a guide. And while the scars of the crack epidemic remain, so does the resilience of the people who lived through it. If the shocking connections between the CIA, the Contras, and the crack epidemic left you stunned, don't stop here. Subscribe to our channel. Explore more untold stories of hidden scandals, devastating truths, and the lives caught in the crossfire of history.